In the cold, mist-covered dawn of September 21st, 1327, the ancient walls of Berkeley Castle stood silent, heavy with a darkness not even torches dared disturb. That morning, behind those stone walls, a disturbing chapter of European royalty quietly came to its end. Inside, Edward II, then 43 years old, lay imprisoned. Chained, humiliated, and abandoned, he moved like a ghost through the shadowy corridors. He was once King of England, but now he was just a man stripped of everything, left to rot in obscurity. That night, no one heard the screams, only muffled groans, swallowed by thick pillows and dense fog. According to later accounts, his assassins used a red-hot iron, inserted through a hollow horn, to inflict fatal internal injuries without leaving any visible wounds. His cries, they say, were silenced as pillows pressed tightly against his face. By morning, Edward's lifeless body was found. The official cause? Natural death. But there was nothing natural about the silence that followed. To truly understand why Edward met such a horrific end, we have to go back. Back to the beginning, to the birth of a prince whose life was anything but ordinary. Edward was born on April the 25th, 1284, at the Grand Castle of Caernarfon in Wales. He was the son of Edward I, one of the most feared kings in medieval England. His father was a warrior, a conqueror, a man obsessed with power and control. But young Edward was different. While other princes trained with swords and armor, Edward preferred water. He loved to swim, row, and fish. He was fascinated by handiwork, crafting, mending roofs, forging iron. For a royal heir, this was almost scandalous. These odd passions would eventually drive a wedge between him and his father. That distance only grew wider when Edward developed a deep bond with Piers Gaveston, a charming knight from Gascony. The elder Edward noticed how close they had become and didn't like it one bit. In a move that revealed both control and suspicion, the king exiled Gaveston. But Edward couldn't let him go. He pleaded for Gaveston's return and even suggested granting him a noble title. For a king who had spent his life tightening royal authority, watching his son grow attached to a foreign courtier, one outside the established power structure, was deeply unsettling. In 1307, when King Edward I died, his son took the throne and wasted no time in bringing Gaveston back. But this time, not just as a friend. He elevated him to Earl of Cornwall, a title usually reserved for royalty. During his own coronation, Edward allowed Gaveston to carry St. Edward's crown, the most sacred symbol of the English monarchy. The nobility was outraged. Whispers turned to rumors. Were Edward and Gaveston merely close companions, or something more? There was no hard evidence of romance, but the king's actions, his gifts, his gestures, his unwavering affection, spoke volumes. In the eyes of the nobles, it was all too much. Eventually, their patience snapped. Gaveston was exiled again, this time permanently. A group of powerful lords captured him and executed him. Edward was devastated. But instead of retreating, he repeated the pattern. Another favorite rose, Hugh Dispenser the Younger, and this time, things got even worse. While Edward grieved, he also pushed forward, surrounding himself with Dispenser and his father, Hugh Dispenser the Elder. Together, they gained unprecedented influence, seizing lands, handing out favors, and dominating royal decisions. Their greed and cruelty earned them enemies everywhere, from noble households to commoners. Meanwhile, Queen Isabella, Edward's wife, was growing more and more alienated. She had married him in 1308. As the daughter of King Philip IV of France, their union was supposed to strengthen diplomatic ties. But the marriage was troubled from the start. Edward ignored her at public events. His affections were clearly elsewhere, with Gaveston, then the Dispensers. For years, Isabella played the quiet, dutiful queen. But as her husband's reign spiraled deeper into corruption and humiliation, she began plotting in the shadows. The breaking point came in 1314. Edward led his army into battle at Bannockburn, facing the Scots under Robert the Bruce. The result? Disaster. His army was crushed, and Edward's reputation took a blow he never recovered from. England's nobility, already resentful, saw their chance. And Isabella, she saw her opening. In 1325, Edward sent her to France to negotiate peace. But she had other plans. Instead of returning, she joined forces with Roger Mortimer, a powerful English noble who had escaped the Tower of London after a failed rebellion. Together, they formed a secret alliance. A year later, in September 1326, Isabella landed in England with a small army. And instead of being seen as traitors, they were welcomed as liberators. Edward fled with the Dispensers, but his support was crumbling. He was eventually captured, along with Hugh Dispenser the Younger. What followed was not just execution, but spectacle. Dispenser was hanged, drawn, and quartered in a public display meant to terrify. Edward, stripped of his crown and his dignity, was forced to abdicate in January 1327. His teenage son, also named Edward, was crowned in his place. The former king was sent to Berkeley Castle. Officially, he wasn't a prisoner, but everyone knew what that really meant. He had become a problem, one that needed to be handled quietly. At first, Edward's captors, Thomas de Berkeley and John Maltravers, treated him with minimal dignity. But as time passed, orders from above grew more ambiguous. "Don't kill him," they were told, "but make sure he doesn't live much longer." Whispers spread of eerie sounds from the castle, cries in the night, howls of anguish. Some spoke of total isolation, of cruel tricks meant to drive him mad, starvation, false letters, psychological torture. Then came that September night. The final act. No official witness, no surviving confession, just fragments of rumor and retellings. But one version has endured, the one with the horn, the searing iron, the silencing pillows, a method of execution so violent and so calculated, it left no trace, only a corpse and a royal lie. 10 years after Edward II's official death, something unexpected surfaced, a letter. It arrived at the papal court, written by a Genoese priest named Manuel Fieschi. What it claimed was astonishing. Edward, he said, hadn't died at Berkeley Castle at all. He had escaped. With help from sympathizers, he fled to Europe and lived out the rest of his days in Italy, disguised as a humble hermit. According to Fieschi, he had heard the confession himself. In a small Italian village, the former king, stripped of his crown and name, lived a life of penance, haunted by the sins of his reign, consumed by guilt. The letter described a man who had once ruled a kingdom, now hiding behind a robe, far from the eyes of those who once bowed to him. The letter was never verified. Some called it a clever forgery. Others believed it was an attempt to undermine the new regime. But it posed a question that still echoes through the centuries. What if Edward survived? What if the brutal tale of the hot iron wasn't a murder, but a cover-up? After all, it would have been politically risky to publicly execute a former king. Too many factions, too many sympathizers. A martyr could be more dangerous than a living exile. Could Queen Isabella and Mortimer have staged Edward's death to keep the kingdom calm and themselves in power? Maybe. But that power didn't last long. In 1330, Edward III, Edward II's son, finally seized control of his own throne. At just 18 years old, he turned against the people who had installed him. Mortimer was arrested and dragged before a council. Accused of treason, he was executed swiftly, hanged without the grotesque ceremony given to Dispenser, but with the same finality. As for Isabella, the queen who had once ruled from the shadows, she was stripped of authority and sent to live the rest of her life in a convent. A queen turned prisoner, silenced like the husband she betrayed. Meanwhile, the tomb of Edward II in Gloucester Cathedral became a place of pilgrimage, a monument, a symbol. But was he really there? Was that truly Edward's body beneath the stone slab? Or had history pulled off one of its most elaborate vanishing acts? The mystery of Edward's fate would divide historians for centuries. But even if the stories of escape are fiction, the tragedy of his life remains painfully real. He was a king born into a brutal world, but he himself was not brutal. In a time when rulers were expected to conquer, dominate, and intimidate, Edward stood out. He was sensitive, affectionate, curious about things that didn't involve swords or bloodshed. He preferred rowing to riding, craftsmanship over combat, friendship over fear. And for that, he was punished. His love, or perhaps deep companionship, for men like Gaveston and Dispenser was weaponized against him. His refusal to fit the mold of a warrior king made him appear weak. His emotional vulnerability, so human, so relatable today, was used to justify his downfall. Even his marriage became a battlefield. Isabella, at first a quiet observer, ultimately became his most formidable enemy. Their marriage began as a political alliance between England and France, but it ended as a Cold War, with treachery on both sides. While Edward clung to his favorites, Isabella found strength in rebellion. She used diplomacy, military force, and public opinion to dismantle the very man she had once called husband. In many ways, Edward's life was a play in 3 acts: the misunderstood prince, the scandal-plagued king, and the fallen man. And the final curtain? That was written by fire, iron, and silence, or perhaps by flight, disguise, and redemption. His son, Edward III, would go on to become one of England's most celebrated monarchs. He restored the crown's power, led England into military glory, and distanced himself from the shame of his father's reign. But the shadow of Edward II lingered. It always did. Because Edward wasn't just a failed king. He was a reflection of the cost of being different in a world that demanded conformity. He ruled with affection in a time that demanded cruelty. He trusted those he loved when the game of power demanded betrayal. And ultimately, it destroyed him. Or so we think. Centuries later, Edward II would be reimagined by historians, playwrights, and filmmakers as a tragic hero. A figure not just of political failure, but of emotional complexity. In the plays of Christopher Marlowe, in the writings of modern scholars, even on screen, where his story is often distorted but never forgotten. His death, whether by iron or exile, became a symbol. A symbol of what happens when the crown becomes a cage. And yet, there's one last twist. Because even in death, Edward continued to haunt those who overthrew him. Mortimer's downfall, Isabella's quiet confinement, the hush that fell over the court whenever his name was spoken. His story became more than just royal scandal. It became a warning. A reminder that kings are still human, that thrones are built on secrets, that silence sometimes speaks louder than truth. The legacy of Edward II didn't end with his death or disappearance. In many ways, it only grew louder after he was gone. His son, Edward III, may have restored the monarchy's strength, but the cautionary tale of his father lingered like a specter in the royal halls. It shaped how future kings would rule and how far they'd go to keep control. Because Edward II's downfall wasn't just about poor leadership. It was about the terrifying realization that even a king could be overthrown, not by a foreign army, not by disease or divine will, but by his own people, his own wife, his own court. He was the first English king to be formally and publicly deposed. And that changed everything. It sent a shockwave through the monarchy, a warning etched into the stone of Westminster and whispered across the marble floors of every European palace. No crown was safe, no throne untouchable. And the man behind that precedent? A monarch remembered less for what he did and more for who he was. To some, Edward II was simply incompetent, a weak ruler, too distracted by his favorites and too soft for the brutal demands of medieval politics. To others, he was something far more compelling, a pioneer of emotional vulnerability within a role built on stoicism and cruelty. His connection to Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Dispenser wasn't just controversial, it was revolutionary. It challenged the rigid expectations of masculinity and power. It shattered the illusion of the king as a cold, invulnerable figure, and in doing so, it made him a target. Chroniclers of the time, eager to justify his fall, exploited his relationships. They painted him as indulgent, immoral, unstable. But peel back the layers of political propaganda and you see something else. A man, flawed, yes, but deeply human. A king who found joy in friendship, who saw beauty in craft, who valued loyalty over politics, who may have loved, truly loved, in a world that had no tolerance for such things within a royal frame. The tragedy, then, isn't just in how he died, it's in how he lived. How a gentle spirit, born into a brutal machine, was chewed up and discarded by the very system he was expected to command. How his differences were twisted into defects. How his empathy became his weakness. And how his refusal to play the part of the cold, war-hardened king led to a slow, humiliating erasure. And yet, his story survived. Despite every attempt to bury it, literally and metaphorically, it endured. The Gloucester tomb, a monument to a controversial figure, became more than a burial site. It became a shrine to mystery, to possibility. Pilgrims came, historians speculated, and generations of storytellers reimagined the man once silenced in the dark. Was he a victim of treason, a failed king, a hidden lover, a martyr? Maybe all of the above. What we know for sure is that Edward II's reign altered the monarchy forever. His deposition introduced the idea that a king's power could be revoked, not by divine will, but by political force. That the people around the throne could wield more power than the one who wore the crown. It redefined the balance of English politics. It set a precedent for rebellion. And it terrified every monarch who followed. Because if it could happen to him, it could happen again. And it did. Time and time again. The echoes of Edward's fall rang out through the centuries, shaping the fates of rulers who dared to show weakness, or humanity, or difference. And perhaps that's the darkest truth of all, that in a world obsessed with control and dominance, being too human is the most dangerous trait a king can have. That's why the story of Edward II belongs not just in textbooks, but in whispers, in shadows, in the corners of cathedrals where the light doesn't quite reach. It's a tale of power and pain, of identity and betrayal, of what it costs to be yourself when the crown demands something else entirely. It's a story that burns, even centuries later. So if you ever stand before the tomb at Gloucester, pause. Ask yourself, is he really there? Or did a king slip through the cracks of history, leaving behind only a ghost and a question? Because in the end, Edward II wasn't just a king who lost his throne. He was a man who paid the ultimate price for not being what the world expected. And that is a legacy no iron can erase. Welcome to Echoes of Torture, where we reveal the secrets power tried to bury, behind castles, beneath crowns, and within the minds of those who dared to defy the script. If stories like this captivate you, the betrayals, the executions, the quiet conspiracies hidden in royal courts, then subscribe, tap the bell, and share this video with those who think monarchy was all gold and glory. Here, we uncover the truths that textbooks avoid. Because sometimes, the truth burns hotter than a glowing iron.